My pleasure to go ahead and pass this over to your presenter for today. Jackie Bennett is the Deputy Director of Great Apes and Regional Accreditation with GFAS, and Jackie, you now have the ball.
Thank you, Robin. And thanks everyone for being here. This is our second session. We did this last week, and succession planning is one of the parts, one of the components of sustainability for an organization, and it's something that GFAS looks at when we are working with an organization towards accreditation. And, it's one of the things that whether it's a large or small organization or staffed or all volunteer, that often there isn't a succession plan in place and there are questions of how to do it. So today we're going to go through an oversight of that for different scenarios, different kinds of organizations, and also what to do if you think your plan would be that if you are a founder, you're the director of an organization where it will not continue after you and you would plan to transfer your animals to a different sanctuary, how GFAS would work with you on that and what things you need to think about. So, and at the end, I'm going to give you some links to some really great resources that you can take back and talk to your staff, talk to your boards, and really go through some checklists that will help you to put together your succession plan. So we'll start with the GFAS Standard. This is what we have in our written standards for all of the animal groups. And this is something that we look at for full accreditation, that, let me get my arrow, that we want to see a written plan. It definitely should cover the sanctuary director, but maybe, depending on the structure of your organization, some other key management positions. Again, depending on the structure of your sanctuary. There should be written job descriptions. We'll talk about that. It's not just for a succession plan where the director is planning to leave or retire. It should include emergency or short-term succession planning as well. And when you're talking about replacing or temporary replacing as a successor a new executive director of an organization, there should be some discussion about what the role of the board of directors or trustees would be as part of that transition planning. We will go through all of those. There we go. So what is a succession plan? As the standard showed, it's more than just replacing a long-term transition for the executive director. It's also planning for contingencies. It's planning for the unexpected. And with this, we're not just talking about someone who is absent with the flu or another illness for a couple of days. We're talking about significant amounts of time, 30 days, 60 days. They may be anticipated leave. It may be very sudden if someone becomes ill or injured or if someone passes away. So it may be that someone leaves permanently, but that has not been planned. These are the different scenarios, the different contingencies that succession plans would cover. And why is it important? Well, it's pretty obvious. You want your organization to continue if something happens to you, and we all have to consider the possibility that something can happen, and everyone at some point is going to be, I hate to use the word replaced, but transition to someone else taking on a role if the organization is going to continue. Succession planning is necessary for any nonprofit, and it's an opportunity to talk. It shouldn't be something that, I know it can be emotional sometimes, and depending on how it's approached, people can become defensive about it. But it should not be looked at that way. It should really just be part of the strategic planning and discussions about the future of the organization. And if your organization is going through a strategic planning process, especially if you may have a facilitator involved with those discussions, the topic of succession planning can really be rolled into that and part of it. And to have a positive discussion where everyone's viewpoints are considered. So it's not just important for internally at your organization. We did a webinar on strategic planning last month, and one of the things we talked about was Your plan is important for the running of your organization and looking to the future of your organization, but it's also a great marketing tool. It's a great way to say to funders and other supporters and stakeholders that you have an organization that's going to survive. You have an organization that's thought about the contingencies and is prepared to handle it. I talked to one foundation to get their perspective on succession planning, and the person told me, you know, most organizations don't have succession plans. So if you have one, even if you can do a summary of it or mention it in the description of your organization, it should be something that you tell funders about. It will help you stand apart. So with that, let's talk about how you would go about with this, with putting together a strategic plan and beginning the conversations in your organization to get the plan in place. It really starts with two concepts. One is the idea of position or job descriptions. And I say position descriptions because even if you are an organization that's all volunteer or mostly volunteer, that doesn't mean succession planning doesn't apply. Whether it's a director position or a finance director position that someone's doing voluntarily, you still should be looking at what is that position description, what are the functions and duties of that position, and think about that in terms of strategic planning. I always say that if an organization doesn't have succession plan, that if they have a good up-to-date job description and an organizational chart as well, you're really halfway there, because your job description, if you're looking down a bulleted list of the functions of the position, it really gives you a checklist to consider how you might fill in that position if someone's gone, with the concept of cross-training. And the idea of cross-training is that there's someone else in your organization that can take over the key functions of another position if that person is unexpectedly or expectedly gone, whether short-term or long-term. And it may be with a position that more than one person in the organization is cross-trained to take on different aspects of that job if we're talking about covering something for a 30-day or 60-day period. But what you want to do is make sure that there is going to be, no abrupt interruption in your operations, in the services you provide, and in your communications to the public and to other stakeholders. So job descriptions, are they written? Are they up to date? A lot of times they aren't, and some of the feedback we get, again, is, well, everyone is a volunteer, or maybe a director will say, well, I have them for others, but not for me. And I would say the director's position description, whether it's a paid or unpaid position, is the most important one to have in writing, or we all know what we do, which is great, except if there is some interruption of that by someone unexpectedly being absent. The other thing is it up to date? Because jobs do evolve, and it may be that the only time you've done your position description is when you were posting for a job vacancy. Positions filled, and maybe the same person has been in the position for years. When is the last time that job description was looked at? Because jobs evolve over time. It may be that several years ago you weren't doing as much with social media. We're all doing more with social media than we were several years ago. And so perhaps that wasn't really part of someone's job description, but someone has taken over that duty. And who would do that if that person was unexpectedly absent for a period of time? For the sanctuary director, whether the title is executive director or director, the job description should really be something that is worked on or looked at or discussed with the board of directors. And I realize in a small organization or even a large organization, the sanctuary director may also sit on the board of directors. But, as a matter of governance, a full board of directors or trustees oversees the executive director's role and performance. And there should be a full understanding with the entire board of what the director does. As far as other positions in an organization, this may sound like a lot of work for a director to do, But this was one of the comments I got after last week's session. Someone pointed out this work can really be delegated. It may sound overwhelming for a director, like, oh, now I've got to sit down and write everyone's job description, review everyone's job description. Delegate it. Delegate it to the person who's doing the job. Have them look over their description. See if they think it's current. See if it covers everything that they are doing. And have them initially revise or redraft it or maybe write it in the first instance. So it doesn't have to all fall on one person to do. It can be spread around in the organization. And that's probably a good thing in terms of good communication of what everyone does so there are no misunderstandings about that. So job description, every kind of job description, every position should be in writing, even if they are positions that you're not working on for succession planning. And they should be looked at and updated periodically to make sure they still are meaningful, that they still really describe what that person is doing. So cross-training. Cross-training, as I said before, is the idea that you have at least one person who can step in the absence of a key management person and take over all of their core duties, maybe not everything, but all of them, or maybe part of them. Maybe it's broken down. But when you're thinking about cross-training, especially if you are the director of an organization, it's not just what you do, but what you have access to. And think about, if you are the only person who has access to these things and something unexpectedly happens to you, who's going to be able to access this, and do they know about it, and how? And, you know, these are things as simple as what are some passwords you need to get to your online banking? Can someone else sign checks? Who's your insurance contact for liability insurance and other insurance? You don't want your permits to expire, to not renew your applications. Key contacts with funders. You know, especially in an organization, if you are the founding director, your role is very important, and your relationships with stakeholders is very important. But think about what would happen if something happened to you. You know, who would be the person in your organization who could make those contacts? So these things, and one of the references I will show you at the end, one of the links, will give you a checklist, like an operations checklist for these kinds of things that a director or someone else in the organization can work through and update. These things are just as important as training someone in skills, because you don't want your organization to be unable to operate because someone can't access the bank account to pay your bills, to pay your suppliers, to be able to buy food for the animals. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that should be shared publicly. This is confidential information. This is sensitive information. But if, for example, it's a situation where the director has all of this information, you put it together and maybe give it to your board chair or someone on your board of directors, so someone has it in the event that something happens to you and can give it as needed to the people taking over some tasks during your absence. And I should at this point, because we don't have any questions or comments coming in, if anyone does have comments as we are going along, you know, please write them in. We will have a period for questions at the end, but we can certainly take some questions or comments as we go through this too. All right. So at this point, let's say you have nice written current job descriptions and you've gone through them. Your staff, whether they're paid staff or volunteer staff, have their current job descriptions. They've maybe given you some input. So everything's up to date, very clear. You've thought about who might step in if you're going to be absent or if someone else is absent. So now you're ready to go through a succession planning process. And what should that include? As I mentioned before, if you are doing a strategic planning process, it's great to roll this into it. It's kind of a natural add-on piece to strategic planning, but you can do it separately also. So the checklist, and this should be something that, if it's for the director, should be worked on with the board of directors or maybe a committee of the board of directors. If there are other management positions working under the sanctuary director, it would be done at the staff level. So what positions are you going to be looking at to plan for the contingencies? What are the key job responsibilities? And you can summarize that in a strategic plan or in a summary plan, or you can attach it. We want to think about the cross-training and the people to back up positions on a temporary basis. Think about if you need to do some cross-training for one or more people and what that should include. What does everyone need to take over their assigned roles? If we're talking about the executive director, the sanctuary director, determine the board's role in supervising the acting director. It may be, if there's going to be a long-term absence of the executive director, that the board might hire as a consultant, an interim executive director, and would supervise that person. So things like that. And the last thing is really important and not always considered as part of succession planning. There needs to be a communication plan in the event of an emergency succession. And I'm not saying if the executive director is going to be out for a while, with surgery and illness, a family emergency, that a press release should be issued to the world about that. I'm not saying that at all. But if you know that someone is unexpectedly going to be gone permanently or going to be gone temporarily, who are your closest stakeholders? Who needs to be told about this? And that's important because you don't want someone calling trying to contact the sanctuary director and they're just, she's not there today, she's not there today, and it goes on for a month or something. Things do happen, and your fellow sanctuaries, your contacts at foundations, the people who give you your grants, you want to think of a communication plan, whether it be in writing or making a series of phone calls, to let them know that temporarily someone else is stepping in, and your organization has it covered to alleviate any concerns that the organization is not going to be able to survive and not going to be able to operate during that time. Because the bottom line is you don't want your supporters to walk away. You don't want your donors to walk away. You don't want your funders to walk away. You want them to know that your organization is strong, even if someone unexpectedly that has been in contact is absent for a period of time or permanently. I've put together a couple of models because I know that we have just a vast range of organizations working with GFAS, and ones that we've accredited or ones we're working on for accreditation. They are large and small. They are sometimes projects of other larger corporations. They may have a very large paid staff, including a senior management tier, or they may be all volunteer. So the question is, what do you need to do as far as succession planning, or what should you consider doing, and what's GFAS going to be looking for, which may be the question you want answered. So here's a small organization. It may be that this is all volunteer, or it may be that the director is paid. The director may be the founder of the organization or not. Maybe the caregivers are all volunteers. And I threw this position in, maybe there's some other reliable long-term volunteer who kind of tries to do everything and maybe also sits on your board of directors. What should you be thinking of? Well, this person, the director, whether it be founder or not, paid or not, this person should have a position description, and a pretty thorough one, because in this scenario, this person is really the key of the organization and a very important person for the survival of the organization. And if something happens to this person and there's no contingency planning and no information so that others can get access to what we talked about, the money, the passwords, the keys, this organization could fall apart pretty quickly. So this is a very important person. We would want to see a job description. And we'd want to see succession planning to talk about who can, one or more people, and it may be that it's some of these people, it's maybe that it's this person or some board members who can step in short term and take over this role. And then long term or permanently, what would be the plan for taking over this role? And when you have this kind of small organization where everyone is a volunteer, this becomes a very important question, thinking about what if we had to replace the director permanently, because it may be that this director doesn't take a salary, but to find a successor, you're going to have to pay someone. And that's a big change in the budget. It's a big change in financial planning. And this is one where the board of directors should really be thinking about that contingency. As far as other position descriptions, well, certainly there should be some kind of standard operating procedures or to-do lists or to-don't lists for caregivers, not necessarily succession planning for them. And, there should be some kind of guidelines in place for this person, especially if he or she is supervising volunteers. But for the purpose of succession planning and who should be included, at a minimum, the director must have a succession plan in place. And this is something that GFAS would ask about and, of course, work with you and help you with it. But maybe your organization doesn't look like this. Maybe it looks more like this. And this is not a particular organization. This is something I put together. But large organizations may have much more of a paid management structure. And it may be a situation where this whole structure is for the sanctuary. Everyone is on site. It may be in the structure that the sanctuary director is the person on site and the sanctuary is a project of a much larger organization that's doing other things as well. And so the CEO is not going to be off site and maybe not as directly involved day to day. And maybe these other VP positions would not be on site. So all of these positions really should have job descriptions, up-to-date current job descriptions. What would GFAS look for accreditation? Well, absolutely, positively, this person. And it may be that there are two people here. It may be that there's someone, if the CEO is off-site, there may be an on-site sanctuary director and an on-site animal care director. We see these positions broken up in different ways. But these roles, these responsibilities definitely need succession planning in place, short-term and long-term. What's going to happen if these people or person becomes ill or injured or something worse happen? Now, if the CEO is on site, if we're talking about this being all the staff of the sanctuary, we would want to see this position also, succession planning. And this is someone who's there running the business aspect, overseeing the budgeting, all of that for the sanctuary, and is a key person, clearly, and would need a succession plan in place, short-term, emergency, and long-term. If this person is off-site, if we have a situation where it's a larger organization, the sanctuary is a project, we might not say we have to see this one for accreditation. Remember, we have to see this person or these people, but strongly recommend having a succession plan for this person because, it's really probably the face of the organization and communicating the mission of the organization. Wouldn't necessarily look for a succession plan for these individuals as required for accreditation, and it might depend on what roles they played. But again, these are key positions, and we would strongly recommend that they are included in succession planning. And we definitely want to know that they have position descriptions in place that are current. One funder pointed out to me that this is a role that's often neglected in succession planning. And I'm not saying there should be a succession planning for a veterinarian, but if you are having some strategic discussions about it, it's a good thing to talk about. And this would be in a scenario where a sanctuary is fortunate enough to have an on-site clinic and staff veterinarian and really have all of those capabilities on site. But what happens if you lose your veterinarian, whether it be short-term or your veterinarian leaves, quits, gets a different position, whatever happens. Just something to think about if you have not needed to develop working relationships with other veterinarians in your general area, and I know they might not be close by. Consider, would you be able to get some help from other sanctuaries, maybe have a veterinarian on loan or someone to consult with you. It's something that can really cause a big disruption if you are used to just having everything in-house and on-site, and then you don't have that staff position filled. So that's just some advice I'm passing along. It's not something that we're going to require for accreditation, but if you're having this conversation thinking about contingencies, as this funder pointed out, it's often a forgotten contingency that could have a big impact if it happens. All right, so we've looked at the scenarios. I'm going to give you an example. This is an old plan, but I still like using it as an example. It is used with permission from Chimpanzee Sanctuary Northwest, which is a chimpanzee sanctuary. It's a small organization. It's paid staff. It's not volunteers, but it's a small group. And these are some excerpts from the written strategic plan they did, which is as a result of the discussions and the considerations that we've been talking about. So here they refer to not just the executive director of the sanctuary, but of their senior management team, which is more than one person. It's the executive director, director of operations, and director of outreach. And they have this preface written that these are the three positions, the key positions they're going to address if there's an unexpected absence, and how they would transition the duties to other staff members and look for a replacement. And then it says this policy should be updated annually. We'll talk about that because just as you should take a look at your job descriptions from time to time, if your job descriptions change, if your staffing or structure changes, that's going to change probably some of the contents of your succession plan. And you should take a look at it then and revise it. So here's another excerpt from the Chimpanzee Sanctuary Northwest Succession Plan. This is not for the executive director position. This is for the other key management position of director of outreach. So it starts out by kind of just defining the core capabilities, I guess you'd say, of this position, or what this person does, what their main goals are, what they're responsible for. And then it goes on to define what are the skills that would be needed if you had to recruit someone to fill this position if it was empty. And then it talks about the temporary distribution of the key duties of the director of outreach position. And it may be that especially if it's short term, you're not going to have someone do every little thing that the position does. But you do need to have a temporary distribution of the duties of the key parts of this job description so that there isn't a disruption in them. And one of the reasons I like using this example, other than the fact that it's just very clearly laid out in kind of outline form, is that it shows that there may be more than one person stepping in to take over the position duties. So here the executive director is going to take one thing on the checklist. Senior caregiver is going to be doing something. Senior caregiver here. The other management position, director of operations here. So again, in terms of the cross-training we had talked about, it's not like you have to figure out one and only one person in your organization to be cross-trained to fill in for the director of outreach. It may be easier, more convenient, and just more efficient to spread out those duties a bit, depending on what these people's capabilities and experience are, and maybe the least amount of cross-training that would be involved. Back when I put up the checklist of what your succession planning process should be, I did put something in about the role of a board of directors or trustees. And when you're talking about the absence or departure, transition to a new executive director, the succession plan should talk about the role of the board of directors in overseeing this transition, especially if it is a planned departure. When there is a situation where an organization knows that the executive director, and typically as being a founding director, is planning to retire or maybe move on and do something less full time, whatever, there is the luxury of planning, and that is often a good time to go back and look at your strategic plan, to really work with your current executive director to talk about his or her vision of the future of the organization, what his or her remaining goals are, and get the executive director's input moving forward of who the next director should be, and what the immediate goals are. So again, not a threatening process, but really a positive process of discussion. The board of directors has to take on some role, or maybe a committee of the board of directors, in hiring an interim director if they're going to be bringing someone from the outside rather than having someone inside the organization step in temporarily. You have to think about salary ranges, especially, as I said, if you're going from having an unpaid director, usually the founder, because no one else will probably take an unpaid position. And I just want to say, and I said this last time, it's impossible to replace the founder of an organization. And I hate to use the word replace because we work with so many founders, and there's just a time commitment and a sacrifice, and often not taking any salary or taking a very small salary, that you can't replace that person. If there comes a time where a board needs to find a successor, you can just find a worthy successor, but it's never going to be the same person. It's the vision of the organization going forward. But that's where the board of directors role comes in, that there are changes with getting a new executive director, a new leader to the organization, especially if you're stepping in after the founder. And these are responsibilities, governance responsibilities, that the board of directors should be involved in and be responsible for. But I did want to say something else about the board of directors. And again, this was something that was input given from a funder, that succession planning applies to a board of directors or trustees as well. And in the context of some strategic discussions about a strategic plan or a succession plan, it's also a good time for a board of directors to think about board development. Look at what the board has, maybe what the board needs, and think about what the board should do to identify potential board members, grow the board, maybe people who've been on the board for a long time need to step off the board. How do you replace them? And we do talk to organizations where board of directors are, they're quite tired, and some of them want to step off the board, even if temporarily, and say, but there's, we can't find anyone else to step in, so I just have to keep going and going. So the idea of succession planning is not just for an executive director, and it's not just for staff. It's something for the board as well. And if there are any board members, or if you'd like to pass along to your board members, I just put a couple of articles in here about how boards can examine their skills and kind of think of board development plans to bring in some more capabilities, some more experience and skills into the board. And now, you've got your great job descriptions, everyone is cross-trained, you've had some great positive discussions, you put together a succession plan. What do you do next? We've talked about job descriptions needing to be current, so they should be reviewed at least annually, and we do recommend that any policies really be reviewed annually, seeing if they need to be updated to reflect changes in your organization. But definitely when job duties change, the job descriptions should change, and succession plans should be reviewed to reflect any changes in job descriptions, reflect any changes in personnel, or reflect the changes that are needed on who is assigned as someone being cross-trained to take a particular duty or function for a position where the person is absent. And, if there is a different backup identified for the position, make sure he or she is aware of the plan. And what I mean by that is, say your organization has an executive director and an assistant director, with the understanding that the assistant director will step in the executive director's absence. The assistant director leaves and you hire someone new, so you still have an assistant director. Make sure that person knows that he or she is the backup. Make sure he or she has that strategic planning information. And as far as what we had talked about with access to the operations tools of your organization, the keys, the passwords, whatever, make sure that person, that new person, has access to what he or she needs, whether you give it to that person right away or someone on your board has it and is prepared to give it to that person if they're absent. And again, let supporters know you're prepared for contingencies. You can put this into a grant application. You can put this into, communications to your stakeholders. It's always great to let people know that you communicate with each other, that you meet, you discuss, you're on the same page and have an understanding of the future of your organization. So just as we have said, once you have a strategic plan, make it a marketing tool. Let people know that your organization has considered contingencies. And although you may not put the specifics of the succession plan on your website, do let funders know. Do drop it into a grant application, a description of your organization, some background, or even if you have a summary of it, perhaps attach it to a grant application. Just let them know that you are a good functioning organization because you will stand apart. Now, let's talk about this scenario. And I know this is being recorded and we have some people out of the country who will hear it. This is probably more of a U.S. Scenario, because in many countries we will see outside of the U.S., the wildlife remains owned by the government, so this is probably not applicable. But we do hear from some sanctuaries, and it's typically smaller sanctuaries run by a founder, that once the founder can no longer run the sanctuary, whether by passing away or just becoming ill, that the plan is that the animals will be transferred to another sanctuary. Is that okay? Under the GFAS standards, and when we are working with you, the answer is it could be okay. But maybe, and I'm going to talk about the kinds of questions that we would ask and the kinds of things that you should consider if that is your succession plan. It's not the typical succession plan of succession in personnel. It's a successive home for the animals. And so it does require planning. It does require putting things in writing. It does require thinking of the contingencies and being ready for those. So if you have another organization that you say is going to take your animals, there should be an agreement in place. There should be in writing. It is not going to be enough to say, I'm hoping to do this. That's not going to be enough for GFAS. It's not going to be enough to say, I work with so many sanctuaries, I know someone will help. I know someone will do it. Maybe they will. But that's not going to be enough. We need to see something more substantive than that. And if you do have someone who is willing to take your animals, and this is just not going to be possible with a large organization. And it's challenging even with a small number of animals. But if you have a manageable number and you do have an agreement in place, here's some things to think about. If this is happening because you've passed away, who's going to implement this plan? There's still an existing nonprofit organization. Some work has to be done to wind down that organization. There's still a board of directors. Who puts this plan in motion? Who's going to take care of the animals until that time of transfer? Who's going to arrange for transport? Who's responsible for costs? Have you set aside a reserve fund for the cost of transport and veterinary costs related to that? What permits you need? Are you going to be crossing state lines? Do you know that the animals are going to get the same quality of care as you are giving them? And that's not just the care, but is the organization meeting the standards that you're meeting and frankly, that GFAS would want them to meet, which is that they're not going to be sold, they're not going to be exploited. If it's an animal that is not or cannot be permanently contraceptive, are they going to be allowed to breed? Those are things that should be part of the agreement with the receiving organization, that they give the assurances. And then again, is your organization going to make a monetary donation for the continued care of the animals? If your organization is winding down, what happens to the supplies, the equipment, the cages, or maybe a trailer? Is that going to go to the new organization? Or not new organization, but the organization that's taking the animals. So the short answer is, in theory, there can be a way of doing this that is acceptable to GFAS, but we really do want to see that there is a plan and these contingencies are thought through, because we don't want these animals, as you don't want them, to become homeless. So with that, at the beginning, I promised you some resources on succession planning. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they are. This last one, first, is a publication from the Arcus Foundation called Building Sustainable Sanctuaries. It is a great overview of the aspects of sustainability, including strategic plans, job descriptions, succession plans, financial issues. It's going to give you some other great links. There are some checklists in there. And it really, it gives you some case studies and quotes from sanctuary directors that, are really very, very powerful testimonials about things that have happened or directors are worried about happening because they don't have these sustainability tools in place. So I would very much recommend that book. These other two links, if you and your organization, your team are ready to sit down and talk about succession planning, some of the downloads are a little longer, but they are very much worthwhile. And I will tell you, if you sit down with these and look at them and look at the different tools, they will guide you through the succession planning process in more detail than we can do in 1 hour webinar. So for example, this is going to bring you to some links, including a legacy statement that the existing executive director or founder would want to look at and fill in as a way of working with the board on what he or she sees as the legacy of his or her organization. There's a readiness checklist in there. There's a board of directors self-assessment survey. There's a stakeholder survey. If you're in a position as an organization where you are planning to hire a new executive director, and maybe you want to seek some input from stakeholders on what that new executive director's most important role should be, and this may be something you want to ask funders, for example. There's a sample survey in there. There are also some great assessment tools in here, and there is this operations inventory, which I mentioned before, which is that cross-training checklist that an executive director or other senior management in an organization can fill out. What are the bank account numbers? What are the passwords? Who is our insurance contact? And it can just be filled in, and the blank filled in date of last update. And as there are changes, if you change passwords, you can go in and update this form, keep it in a safe place, or share this with someone on the board of directors so that they always have that information. So with that, I know you're all saving your questions until the end. If anyone has questions or just thoughts or comments or wants to share some of their experiences in a succession planning process, please let us know.
And you can just type that right into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We'd love to get any of your comments or questions.
And no one ever asks me questions. Come on, ask me a question.
You're very
or I'm just going to assume it's very clear. But I will say, you know, we want to help you with this. We do have some templates and samples that we will give out, but if you're really trying to decide what you should be planning for your organization or what positions there should be a succession plan for, you know, we're happy to work with you. We're happy to give you feedback. We're happy to speak with your board members. We're happy to, you know, to look at what's written and you know, ask questions, tell you what we're looking for, and just make sure your organization is comfortable with what you're putting together. So, and just hopefully this has been for those who haven't done this before, you're a little demystified. It takes some time, it takes some thought, but it's doable, and we want to help you.
Well, while we're waiting for any last-minute questions to come in, I just want to say a huge thank you to Jackie for another great presentation. And just as a reminder, we are, as I said, recording this presentation, and we'll get a link out to you once the recording is up and ready to go. And you can definitely feel free to share that with others for them to take a look at. Okay, I've got a question, Jackie.
Yep.
Any differences in documents for very small not-for-profits that are 100% volunteer and don't have the infrastructure such as an ED or paid position?
Well, you know, as I said, it doesn't matter if it's not a paid position, and it's not really a matter of what the name of the title is. Every organization has to have a head person. I mean, everyone has to. Someone is the head person that is, you know, signs off on checks, signs off on permit applications, has a contact with USDA, whatever. So, you know, I showed the two kinds of org chart samples, and the first one was a very simple one, kind of the person at the top who does everything. That is the sanctuary director.
Thanks, Jackie. Karen just asked, she said, I'm assuming emailing you is the best way to reach you with questions later on?
Yeah, I mean, you're free to email me, or if you're working with, you know, Jackie Bexted or with Daryl, whoever you're working with, if you are working on an application, you know, just email and contact. But, you know, we're all happy to help, and I'm happy to answer any other questions or see if there's some other samples I can pull out and send to people.
Thank you, and I've got another question for you. When one follows this plan for a successor, and the successor states they will follow the plan, as does the board, but then they fail to do so, and they change the plan for the animals, what options are there?
That's hard to answer in the abstract. I'm going to assume it's a situation where the current director has left, the successor is in, agreed on successor is in place. You know, the relationship is between that executive director and the board of directors, and you know, things can be changed. You know, it's one thing to change, you know, some protocols or whatever. If it gets to an issue of you know, animals being abused or not fed, then that's a completely different issue. But you can't assume that successors in an organization are always going to you know, stay with the plan. And as we talked about in this presentation, jobs do evolve, and sometimes things do change. So without knowing, you know, details, I don't know how else I can answer that, except, you know, successors with the board of directors can make changes, and they may be good changes, they may be bad changes.
Thanks, Jackie. We have another question asking, what requirements do you list for a sanctuary director, if any?
We don't list that in our standards. You know, we can certainly help someone if they want to, you know, if there is no written description and they want some feedback, we can certainly help you. But the sanctuary director, I mean, we did a webinar last fall that Laura Maloney from HSUS was one of the participants, one of the presenters on, and it was on kind of the line between management and governance and what a board of directors role is and what the management's role is. And you know, I realize in small organizations people wear many different hats, but there still are governance functions of a board of directors and management functions of staff, whether they be paid or not. So we're talking about a sanctuary director, we're talking about the non-governance roles, but there has to be a head person, you know, a CEO who's signing the 990s, who's listed as the top person on a 990, things like that. And they would be responsible for the other staffing, for the program, for the protocols, for overseeing the volunteers, you know, whether directly or delegating that to someone else to do. So all of those sorts of things. It may be that other people take some of those roles from the sanctuary director, but the sanctuary director is the top doer position. You know, not talking about the governance, but actually implementing the policies, implementing the mission.
Thanks, Jackie. That looks like all of the questions that we've gotten in. I want to thank everybody for their questions.